Our speaker is Larry Morris. He is coming to us from Salt Lake City. He is the author, of course, of the co-author of the book tonight, Gloomy Terrors and Hidden Fires, which has been referred to as the definitive biography on John Colter. He also is the author of The Fate of the Corps, What Became of the Lewis and Clark Explorers After the Expedition, and a book called The Perilous West, 7 Amazing Explorers and the Founding of the Oregon Trail. And those are just only a couple of his works. He is also the curator of historic sites for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He lives with his wife in Salt Lake City. They have 4 kids and 6 grandkids. He grew up a little closer to Montana than that. He grew up in Idaho Falls. And he went to school at Brigham Young University, where he got a BA in philosophy and an MA in American literature. So without further ado, and he's currently working on, his next book is going to be on the 1959 Hebgen earthquake. So another project to look forward to. But without further ado, I give you Larry Morris.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate that. It's great coming to Montana. When I was growing up in Idaho Falls, my favorite place to go was north. And we had some really good family vacations in Island Park, West Yellowstone, right in that area. And I have great memories of Virginia City and the Lewis and Clark Caverns. And coming this time, I drove up into Montana on Monday, and I came up, I followed the Gallatin River up and then went over and saw Three Forks, which is one of my favorite spots on the planet. So it's great to be in Montana. And it's fun to talk about John Colter. There's a lot of interest in Colter. And as we did our research, we found a lot of folks who had kind of become obsessed with some of the Colter controversies. And one thing that makes it so fun is that there's a lack of solid information, so people can have a lot of different opinions on things. It's kind of surprising, given all the research that has been done on Colter. To me, it's surprising that the very first record we have that we know is about our John Colter is William Clark's journal entry, December 30th, 1803. And he said Colter killed a deer and a turkey. He's a good hunter right off the bat. And as many of you probably know, Colter apparently enlisted on October 15th, a couple of months earlier. But we don't actually have a record from October 15th. What we have is a list that Clark drew up in 1807 when he said that Colter enlisted on October 15th, 1803. The first actual record made on the same day was the December 30th entry by Clark in his journal. This is the number of letters, diary entries, reminiscences that we have from Colter. So it's an honor for the reviewer to call our book the definitive biography, but we never called it that. Not enough source material. So the interesting thing is, virtually, not all, but 90% of what we know about Colter comes from either Lewis and Clark or financial records. Isn't that the way it goes? They're always keeping track of how much money you owe them, even after you're dead. The one on the left is a promissory note that Colter signed. And what does he owe? $18.25 that he promises to pay. But he did have good news occasionally. This one over here on the right, he signed to Edward Hempstead, who was the attorney handling Meriwether Lewis's estate. When Lewis and Clark got back to St. Louis in 1806, Colter was still out in Montana. And when he finally got back to St. Louis in 1810, Lewis had been dead for several months. Lewis died in October of 1809, and Colter couldn't get his pay for the expedition. And he finally got it in 1811. When did he die? You see different dates. The two dates you usually see are November 1813. Well, that's the date that's been seen for a long time. Then there are two descendants of Colter who are also great researchers, Shirley Winkelhock and Ruth Colter Frick, claimed that he died on May 7th, 1812. But that was new. Up until 1988, researchers only had two documents to go on. Of course, they're both financial. One was in February of 1812, Colter borrowed $45 from William Clark. And the next record we had was a court proceeding concerning Colter's estate on November 22nd, 1813. He had died by November 22nd. He was still alive February of 1812. That's all that was known. And some of those early biographers of Colter presumed that he must have died right before the court procedures began. But I don't know how it works now, but in St. Louis in the early 1800s, even Lewis, who was a prominent person, had connections and had kept a good record of his finances. It was several months before Lewis's estate began to be settled. And with Colter, it was, well, we'll get to that. I'll tell you how they made that discovery. Shirley Winkelhock was in the National Archives in the 1980s searching. Boy, they searched and searched for Colter. And she was looking through some things again, and she found a record for a man named John Colter. And when she took a close look at the index said John Colter. But when she went and looked at the record, it was clear that it was Colter. Because the person who filled it, it was based on some primary document. It was transcribed. And the person who wrote his name crossed both the L and the T. And somebody else thought that was Colter. So all the time it was there in the War of 1812 records, but nobody realized it was really talking about John Colter. And that record has a lot of information. It says that he served in Captain Nathan Boone's company from March 3rd to May 6th, 1812. He was supposed to be paid $65, $1 a day, and he died the very next day, May 7th, 1812. And the money that he had borrowed from Clark was in February. Possibly he was using that to get supplies for his service. But they don't tell us anything else. In other words, they don't say he was sick and so he was released from the service. All they say is his service ended on May 6th, he died on May 7th. But it is what I think is a very solid record. I think there's good evidence that he did die on May 7th, 1812. Well, how about when or where was he born? There's been a lot of claims made about this. Charles G. Clark wrote the book Men of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and Burton Harris wrote the book about Colter that you've all seen. It's been widely distributed. And Clark said he was born in 1774, and Burton Harris 1770. Both said he was born in Augusta County, Virginia. Well, isn't it interesting? William Clark was born in 1770. Meriwether Lewis was born in 1774. I don't know if that's just coincidence. But what do we really know about Colter's age? We just have one little clue. And Thomas James was a trapper who met Colter in 1809. James had gone up the river with Lisa in 1809. That was the same time that they returned the Mandan chief Sheheke to his home in North Dakota. And James was with that group, and when he arrived at the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in North Dakota, he met Colter. Colter sold him a couple of traps, and it looked like Colter was ready to go back finally to St. Louis. And James, many years later, James wrote that Colter was about 35 in 1809. Well, that would mean he was born in 1774. But I can't look at somebody and say he's 35 years old. How much do you think his estimate could be off? I don't know. Probably 5 years either way, at least, you would think. So that's all we know, is that James said he was about 35. You know, the men of the expedition, they ranged, at the time Lewis and Clark got together in 1803, the men they had with them ranged in age from about 18 to 40. So that isn't much help. The youngest, Sacagawea was a teenager when the expedition started. Now, I don't know if you've heard of Eva Emery Dye, but she was a very prominent writer and historian and women's rights activist who was prominent around 1900. She was really quite a person. I really admire her. And it's really interesting the influence she has had on the Colter legend. It was really my co-author, Ron Anglin, who found all of this. She wrote a book about the Lewis and Clark expedition called The Conquest. And I know that she really worked hard at her research, because I've seen her files up at the Oregon Historical Society. And she wrote to all these descendants of members of the expedition. So she really worked at it, but we can't find any correspondence between her and Colter descendants. No source material for Colter in her files. But she said he was from Virginia. And as far as we could tell, she was the first person to make that claim. People have really looked hard for any birth record. But let me back up a little. After she made that claim, there was a woman who was a member of a Colter family in Virginia who found a record for a John Colter. And she gave some information on who his parents were, and Burton Harris and Charles G. Clark both used that information. But these descendants of Colter, Shirley, Ruth, and Donna Masterson was very prominent in the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. She's also a descendant of Colter. They looked hard and found out that that information was not accurate, because that John Colter was still alive in 1815, and ours died in 1812. Then Catherine Bushman, who was a leading genealogist in Virginia, gave her opinion that she couldn't find any evidence that John Colter of the expedition was born in Virginia. So really, our conclusion is not that he was not born in Virginia. Our conclusion is we don't have any evidence where he was born. We don't know who his parents were. Now here's Eva Emery Dye again. She said the Colter family later settled in Maysville, Kentucky. It's not unreasonable. You know, Clark is a good example of a person who was born in Virginia and went to Kentucky when he was a kid. There's a lot of emigration that way. And then Reuben Gold Thwaite, who produced the first Lewis and Clark journals, he was obviously influenced by Dye, and there's some correspondence between them and some others that shows he was picking up things from her. And he agreed, or he followed her in saying that Colter was born in Virginia, lived in Maysville, and then he added this. Colter joined Lewis and Clark in Maysville in the fall of 1803. So really, the Maysville connection and the Virginia connection both go back to Dye, but the claim that Colter joined Lewis and Clark in Maysville goes back to Twait. So we searched, hoping to find something related to Maysville. And the two archives that we thought we had the best chance of finding something, the Draper Collection in Madison and the Kentucky Gateway Museum Center in, I got a little typo there, it's actually Maysville. My co-author Ron had people looking for months. So actually, the Draper Collection, he had a guy who was an expert librarian looking over a period of years. It's a massive collection there in Madison. It was all collected in the 19th century. And this person searched everything he thought was even possible and didn't find anything on Colter. That's what makes Colter so much fun. Can't find any records. But we do know where Meriwether Lewis was. And he wasn't in, he definitely wasn't in Maysville. You know, he came up the Ohio River from Pittsburgh. And he wasn't keeping a journal on, whenever he was, Maysville is there on the Ohio River, so he went through the area, but he wasn't keeping his journal at that point, so we don't know what day it was. But it definitely was not October 15th, because he had already arrived in Louisville on October 14th. Clark had been recruiting men in the Louisville area, and 9 of them became known as the 9 young men from Kentucky. Colter was one of those, and all 9 of them joined in they were the only members who joined in 1803. The others joined in 1804. And some of those 9 joined before Colter and some after, but he was the only one on October 15th. The next question that comes up is about Simon Kenton. He's got a strong Maysville connection because he settled that area and is kind of a folk hero there. So who knows what the thinking was, but once you conclude that Colter was living in Maysville, I guess it's natural to assume that he got connected with Simon Kenton and served with him. And Charles G. Clark made that claim. So did Richard Dillon, who wrote the biography of Meriwether Lewis. But the first one to say it was Di. We wish that she had left some notes of how she came to these conclusions, but she didn't. So we don't know if she found a document and that document is missing or what, but no one's been able to corroborate her claim. And Kenton was really quite an individual. There's a famous episode where he saved Daniel Boone's life, had many adventures, and he lived a long life like Daniel Boone did. But the same searches didn't turn up any connection between Kenton and Colter. So again, it's not a case of saying he didn't. It's just saying we cannot confirm that. What happened to Colter after he left Lewis and Clark? He left on August 17th, 1806. I'm sure you remember that when Lewis, the reason, well, there's lots of reasons Montana is the greatest Lewis and Clark state. And one reason is there are so many Lewis and Clark trails. And you know, when they went east again, they were returning to St. Louis, and they got into Montana, they started splitting up, and Lewis followed the Missouri River all the way across, and Clark followed the Yellowstone River. And then there were separate groups, so eventually you had five different groups. So all kinds of trails, Lewis and Clark trails in Montana. As Lewis, after he had his encounter with the Blackfoot Indians, he was with 3 others, and they made their way down to the Missouri River and started following the Missouri. And eventually, the group Colter was with had come up from Three Forks, and they united and were following the Missouri River, floating on the Missouri. And Colter and John Collins went out hunting and turned up missing. It was really just a miscommunication, because Lewis thought they were one place, and they thought Lewis was one place, and they got mixed up and got separated. And Lewis really got worried, because he kept going downriver, but he started to get concerned that something had happened to Collins and Colter. And when he got near the North Dakota border, Lewis was out hunting, and Pierre Cruzat accidentally shot Lewis right there. It was probably a good thing, because the wound healed a lot easier than if he'd been shot in the abdomen, But he was still hurting, and not long after that, they met two trappers. Joseph Dixon and Forrest Hancock were going up the Missouri River and wanted some information. And about the same time, here come Colter and Collins. And they're both really good hunters. They haven't had any problem at all. They gave a list. I think Lewis wrote down, or somebody wrote down, what they had done in the time that they had been separated. How many buffalo and elk and deer they had killed. And they'd been living high on the hog all this time. Anyway, Dixon and Hancock may have known Colter, but we don't know, of course, if they did or not. Before the expedition, at any rate, they invited him to come back into Montana with them and trap. And he got permission from Lewis and Clark. And on the 17th of August, there at the Mandan villages in North Dakota, Colter and Dixon and Hancock climbed in a little canoe and started back to Montana. That was the last time that Lewis and Clark saw, that was the last time that Lewis saw Colter. What happened after that? We're not really sure. Peter Cartwright was a famous preacher, and he became a friend of Dixon's, and he wrote that the trio split up soon after they formed their partnership. But it's a second-hand source, and it's late, because Cartwright wrote his book many years after he talked to Dixon. We do know this French-Canadian trader by the name of Charles Corta was in South Dakota in June of 1807, and he was the Arikara Indians there in the northern part of South Dakota wouldn't let him pass. He had a keelboat full of trade goods. First they stole his goods, then they detained him, but he wrote a letter to be given to the officials in St. Louis. It was really directed to Meriwether Lewis, because he was the governor by that time. And in this letter that Colter wrote in June of 1807, he mentioned that he had seen first Dixon, and then about a week later, Hancock traveling down the Missouri River. Well, he knew both Dixon and Hancock, because 2 years earlier he had been on the Missouri River at the same time they were. They went up not long after Lewis and Clark, and he had spent some time with them, so he knew them. He mentions both of them. He doesn't say anything about Colter. But we know that the trio had split up by June. That's certain. And we also have a report, but it's not firsthand. This Corta is a firsthand witness of Dixon and Hancock. We also have a report that Colter signed on with Lisa. In 1807, Lisa had signed on several Lewis and Clark veterans. This was just the next year after Lewis and Clark got back. And of course, Lisa was on his way up the river to make a fortune with the fur trade. And a man by the name of Brackenridge is the one who supplied this information about Colter. In 1811, when Lisa went up, he made several trips up the Missouri, and he went up the Missouri in 1811, and Brackenridge was a lawyer, an author, journalist, who really wanted to observe the trip up the Missouri, and he went with Lisa in 1811. And he, in the course of writing about his 1811 trip, he gives background on Lisa, and in the course of doing that, he talks about Colter, and says that Lisa met Colter at the mouth of the Platte River. This would be late June 1807, and persuaded him to go back up the river. Well, of course, Colter was such a good hunter, and he knew the territory. Lisa reached the mouth of the Bighorn in November and built a fort. And then, according to Brackenridge, Lisa dispatched Colter to bring the Indian nations to trade. And there were 3 others who were sent out to establish good relations with the Indians. Peter Weiser, who was also, and George Druyer, both members of the expedition, and the other one was Edward Rose, who had joined Lisa as Lisa went up the river. And Brackenridge said, with a 30-pound pack, his gun, and some ammunition, Colter went upwards of 500 miles to the Crow Nation. On his return, he and a party of Indians were attacked, and he was lamed by a severe wound to the leg. That's all from Brackenridge. So there's some key questions that historians have asked. First, did Colter, on this journey, did Colter enter Yellowstone Park? If so, he would have been the first known European to see the area. Is Colter's Hell in Yellowstone? Did Colter cross the Teton Range and enter Pierre's Hole in Idaho? Pierre's Hole is there, Victor and Driggs, just west of Jackson, Wyoming, and on the other side of the Tetons. This is part of the 1814 map. When the first history of Lewis and Clark was published by Nicholas Biddle in 1814, this map was included. It's based on a map that William Clark completed in 1810. But from Clark, it had to go to an engraver and some other cartographers who were involved. So it's not exactly William Clark's map. It's safer to say it's based on Clark's map, and of course they wanted to faithfully reproduce it. Now let's see here. Some of it's familiar, some of it isn't. This is the Yellowstone River. And Clark had traveled to Yellowstone. He knew it. So he's not guessing there. And he had seen all these tributaries flowing into the Yellowstone. So if you're over here, the map is pretty accurate. It's either based on Clark's knowledge or good reports from people who saw the area. George Druyer explored a lot of this area, and he and Clark consulted and worked on maps together. Well, there was one of these people who really got obsessed with Colter was a historian by the name of J. Nelson Berry, and he really worked hard at it, and he used to make all kinds of maps depicting he speculated that Colter himself drew maps and gave those to Clark, and Berry produced what he thought were duplicates of Colter's maps, all speculative. But he said, and I think he's right, on this map, the Bighorn, or on the map we just looked at, the Bighorn Basin conforms to actual geography rather well. But the western portion, we're getting over here in this area, is the most extraordinary jumble of muddled geography ever drawn and depicts Colter as crossing 3 tributaries of the Rio Grande in the immediate vicinity of the Platte and Arkansas rivers. You know, the interesting thing is that that northwest corner of Wyoming really is an amazing place when you think of all the rivers that originate there, such as, not in Yellowstone Park, but in that general area, the Wind River, which eventually becomes the Bighorn, and the Snake River, of course, originates there, the Madison, the Jefferson, the Yellowstone. It's an amazing place. And there's also a similar spot in Colorado where the Rio Grande, the Platte, and the Arkansas originate. But Clark kind of had those all jumbled in his mind, which was Zebulon Pike made a similar assumption. So it is kind of a mess over here. But you've got 2 interesting landmarks that create controversy. If you follow the, oh, by the way, this is Gallatin, Madison, Three Forks. It's pretty accurate. And you follow the Yellowstone River down to a lake called Eustis Lake. Then over here is another lake called Lake Biddle or Lake Riddle. Sometimes it's printed Biddle, sometimes Riddle. Well, first time I saw that, I took a look at it and I said, oh, okay, that's obvious. Yellowstone Lake, Jackson Lake. Look, they're both big and they're situated pretty accurately. Well, that was the assumption that Hiram Martin Chittenden made. He said that this was Yellowstone Lake, and this was Jackson Lake. And here you see Colter's route in 1807. It's this dotted line. And it goes over here and it circles around that lake, and then it circles around this lake and goes way over here and circles back up Stinking Water, Shoshone River. Here's the Bighorn. And eventually gets back up here a little west of Billings. And Chittenden concluded that this was Jackson Lake, and that Colter, so if that's Jackson Lake, where are you over here? You're in Idaho. That's exactly what Chittenden concluded. That he, of course, entered Yellowstone Park, because he's traveling near Yellowstone Lake. He entered Idaho, and then Chittenden fudged a little. I'll come back the other way here. Colter's Hell is over by Cody, Wyoming. And the early explorers all agreed that that's where it was. But Chittenden fudged a little and said, well, it applies to both the region over by Cody, and it also applies to Yellowstone Park. And a superintendent of Yellowstone Park jumped on that and started preaching that Colter's Hell was in Yellowstone. So pretty soon people are linking Colter's Hell with Yellowstone. And when I stopped in West Yellowstone the other day, I got to talking to somebody, and they thought that Colter's Hell was basically Yellowstone Park. So that's still alive. This is what Washington Irving said. A volcanic tract, it's not actually volcanic, it's thermal. But it is on the Stinking River, Shoshone River, a tributary of the Bighorn. So Irving in the 1830s, he's got the location right. It's just west of Cody. And Jim Bridger, Joe Meek, those people, they all agreed where it was. And Washington Irving, there's also a legend that nobody believed Colter when he said this, but that isn't what Irving said. and the early explorers, they believed Colter. There are some problems here. Well, the big problem is this. Let's say that is Jackson Lake. Well, here's a river coming out of Jackson Lake, and up here it's identified as the Bighorn. Well, if this were Jackson Lake, the Snake River would be going over into Idaho. So, but given the fact that there are all kinds of mistakes and assumptions being made, naturally, if whatever theory you have to have some leeway with it, with this map. And it was generally agreed among Colter historians that he had gone over into Idaho on that famous trek that he made in 1807. And I certainly believed that when I wrote my book about the Lewis and Clark members. I did the writing about 15 years ago. However, there are problems with that map. And John Logan Allen is a prominent geology professor and a Lewis and Clark expert, and said it's the 1814 version that was produced by those other folks is replete with errors, enough so as to render it nearly useless as a source document. But the original was faded almost to the point of illegibility. Luckily, in 2003, Yale University issued a new version of the map that was digitally remastered. And sorry, I couldn't. It's available out there on the web, and I found it last night, and I could zoom in and see exactly what I wanted, but every time I saved it, it went back to the big map. You couldn't see any detail. But if you go to that site, you can download it. And you can zoom in, and it's just fantastic what you can see. And it's different than the 1814 map. For one thing, the lake to the south, which was identified as Jackson Lake, is much smaller, and it's not as far west. And there's a lot of other differences. So it was quite a thing to get that map enhanced. And Allen, based on his analysis of that remastered 1810 map, he came up with what he thought was Colter's probable route. Now, if you follow the Bighorn up to the Yellowstone, that's where Lisa built his fort, right there. And so he has Colter leaving from Lisa's post and then coming down this way, past Billings and into this part. Let's see, what does he say next? Oh, he's got him coming over here to Clark's Fork, and then coming down to Cody, and then coming down to the Wind River, and then following the Wind River to the source, which is Brooks Lake. It's a beautiful lake. It's not extremely large, nothing like Jackson Lake or Yellowstone Lake. But that is the source of the Wind and Bighorn River. And then from there, what's he got him doing? Going north on the west side of Yellowstone Lake. This is the Yellowstone River, right there, of course. And then crossing the Yellowstone River, and he's getting there in the northeast corner of Yellowstone Park, Lamar River Valley, and then picking up Clark's Fork. See, it starts in Montana and comes down into Wyoming. Picking up Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone, completely different river from Clark Fork that's by Missoula. and following that back up into Montana, all the way to the Yellowstone and then back to the fort. That is Allen's proposed route, based on the enhanced map. Well, Allen has some different answers from Chittenden. He believes that Colter was in Yellowstone Park, obviously. But Colter's Hill is not in Yellowstone. It's over near Cody. And Colter did not enter Idaho, according to Allen. Well, what about this? The Colter Stone. It's in a museum in Driggs. Now here's John. It's hard to read this, but the R is, it's Colt, the E, and then the R is down there. And I'm having a hard time making it out, but the date, 1808, is scratched in this area. And it looks like somebody has kind of carved it into the shape of a human head. It was discovered in 1931 near Teutonia. They are not far from Driggs, Idaho. How do you tell whether it's authentic or not? Well, you don't. It's different with William Clark's signature over at Pompey's Pillar, because we know Clark was there. And so you have something to corroborate, and plus it's the same place. It's not a rock that could be moved from one place to another. And they did that. Out on the Great Salt Lake, there's a rock where Kit Carson supposedly carved his name, and it's considered genuine. There's a stone in Idaho Falls Museum that supposedly has the names of several members of Henry's group. Because Andrew Henry went into that area in 1810 after he left Three Forks. It's considered genuine. But in those cases, they know that the folks were there. We don't know that Colter was in the area. And besides, a stone that a farmer finds in his field, you can only conclude that it's genuine if you have corroborating evidence from some other good source. We don't have a good reason to believe that Colter was ever in that part of Idaho. So what our conclusion about the stone was, we cannot confirm that it's genuine. This is a question that I didn't think about until I was working with Ron Anglin. Did Colter make one journey or two journeys by the spring of 1808? Now, just to review his history a little bit, in the spring of 1808, Colter was involved in that battle. He was with the Crow and the Salish when they were attacked by the Blackfoot Indians, and he was involved in that battle and wounded in the spring of 1808. And then as he recovered, later on in the summer, he and John Potts went over to Three Forks to trap. Potts was killed, and Colter made his famous run from the Three Forks area back to Lisa's Fort, there at the mouth of the Bighorn. So we have a pretty good idea of what was happening with Colter from the spring of 1808 until he died. But we really don't know that much about what happened to him from 1806 to 1808. But here are some things to consider. We all assume, I certainly assumed, that Colter left on his great journey late in 1807 after Lisa reached the mouth of the Bighorn. There's a big problem there, and that is, we know that Druyer also went to visit some Crow Indians at that time, because he talked to William Clark, and Clark made a map and filled in all kinds of details where the Crow villages were and everything. But it was right up there in that area. It wasn't way down in Yellowstone Park or anything like that. It was where Crow villages were up there. And there wasn't a tremendous amount of snow, so a person could have got around at that time in December. Drillier's journey was in December and January, and it would have been feasible. But when you look at Allen's map of where Colter went, it includes these places. Brooks Lake, 9,200 feet, Colter Pass, 8,000, Continental Divide west of West Thumb, 8391, Dunraven Pass, 8859. I mean, these are serious mountain passes. And we consulted with a man who had been a mounted ranger in Yellowstone Park and had all kinds of experience with Yellowstone. And he told us, in fact, he and Ron took a week to travel the area together. He said, no way. He's not going through all of this in the wintertime. Some people have speculated, well, he was wearing snowshoes. Even with snowshoes, I don't know. I doubt it. But there's no evidence that, you can find good evidence of Canadians wearing snowshoes, Canadian explorers. I couldn't find any evidence that the Lewis and Clark or any of those trappers associated with Lisa, I couldn't find any mention at all of snowshoes. But I don't think it would make a difference. Here's another big thing about this trip. Brackenridge said he went to bring Indians to trade. We know that was the case with Drillyer, because he marked there on Clark's map, not the one we looked at, but another one Clark made. It's got all these places where there was a Crow camp, and Drillyer visited them and invited them to trade at the fort there at the mouth of the Bighorn. An emissary of the Crow Nation had no reason to go into Yellowstone Park. This is a little list I made. There's a scholar in Bozeman, Adrian Heidenreich, whom I've met several times, and he's a scholar of the Crow Indians. I've got a map he made, and it lists all these Crow camps that were discovered by explorers or trappers between 1804 and 1851. And the Crow Indians were all over. They had a village near Bear Lake in Idaho, near Teton Pass in Wyoming, a bunch of villages up near the Billings area, near the Tongue River, southeastern Montana at the headwaters of the Powder River. Well, that's in Wyoming, but they were in southeastern Montana, all kinds of Crow villages along the Wind River and the Bighorn River. But when I looked at Adrian's map, he didn't have a single village in Yellowstone Park. So we don't have any evidence that Colter would have gone there to visit the Crow. That was the chief nation that Lisa wanted to trade with. There's not a good reason for Colter to, first of all, it's wintertime. Second, he has no good reason to go in there anyway, if his purpose is to get Indians to trade. Here's another problem. This battle that he was involved in, we know where that took place because when James was traveling with Colter and they were on their way to Three Forks, when they got one day away from Three Forks and they were on the Gallatin River, Colter showed him the battlefield and there were still bones. And this would have been 2 years after the battle. But Brackenridge said that when Colter returned, let's jump back here. Well, yeah, if we look at our map, that's not quite as helpful, but when Colter returned, he started and ended his journey up in this area. And Brackenridge said, as he returned, he got in this battle. Well, the battle was over on the Gallatin River. Not even close. I don't know how far it is. It's not on this map. What, 150 miles, something like that? It's a long ways away. So yeah, so it's a problem, and people never really paid attention to that detail. Let me jump back here. Yeah, so it's nowhere near Allen's proposed route. So there's a contradiction here. William Clark had a preoccupation with rivers, and he was traveling through, he was eastbound on July 26, 1806, and he was near the mouth of the Bighorn, where Lisa would eventually build his fort. And this is what he wrote in his journal. I am informed by the Minotari, that's the Hidatsa Indians, so he must have had this conversation before they left North Dakota, back in, they left in 1805, and others, that this river, the Bighorn, takes its rise in the Rocky Mountains with the heads of the River Platte and at no great distance from the Yellowstone River. Clark was very, he was always making maps. He was quite a good cartographer. And he wanted to know the source of rivers. And that's the entry he made where he's talking about both the source of the Yellowstone and the source of the Bighorn, or Wind River, same river. We speculate that he talked to Colter about this and that expressed interest in knowing where those rivers originated. And this is our scenario. It's speculative, but I think it fits the evidence. Hoping to find the sources of the Yellowstone and Bighorn rivers, Colter started the journey depicted on Clark's map early in the fall of 1806. In other words, right after he and Dixon and Hancock split up quickly. It still would have been October when they were over in, they could have been in this area by October of 1806. And after the partnership fell through, we believe Colter decided to go look for the sources of those rivers. He had gotten along with Clark really well, and when Clark went to explore the Salmon River, Colter was his right-hand man. And it was Colter who took the letter back to Lewis, who was still in Montana, saying the Salmon River is not navigable. At any rate, we believe that Colter went on his big journey in 1806 when the weather was still good enough. And we believe he went counterclockwise, going into Yellowstone Park and getting across the Yellowstone, because he had to cross that Yellowstone River. And it doesn't help much if you wait for winter to pass and go in the spring. Spring runoff, it's a treacherous river. I have a neighbor in her 70s, and her husband drowned fishing in the Yellowstone River in 1970. I got looking at that, that book, Death in Yellowstone. He's mentioned in that book. All kinds of people have drowned in the Yellowstone River. It's not safe. And why would, the question, you have to ask the question, okay, Colter is good at communicating with Indians. He's got a lot of savvy, obviously, in the wilderness. Is he going to go into Yellowstone in the winter or in the spring when he knows the river is going to be dangerous? We think he went in the fall before the weather got real bad and was able to get down to the Brooks Lake, the source of the Wind River, before the winter came on. And we also believe that in December of 1807, when Colter arrived with Lisa at the mouth of the Bighorn, that then he took a trip where he brought Indians to trade, and he was over near Three Forks with Crow Indians when he was attacked. So we believe there were two journeys, but the journey depicted on Clark's map we think happened from the fall of 1806 to sometime in 1807. It's there are a lot of mysteries associated with Colter, but I think that's one thing that makes Colter such an interesting individual, is that you do have to make speculation and do your best with the sources. But I'm really glad to have come to Montana to discuss this. Thanks very much.